Mortrude with World Education, and I'm happy to be here with Anson Green to have this conversation.
Hello, everybody. Anson Green with Tyson Foods Economic Opportunity, and formerly the State Director for Adult Education and Literacy in Texas. So I'm really happy to be here coming from San Antonio. So a little bit of some background for me. You may be wondering why Tyson Foods? Why are we hearing a presentation from a food manufacturer? Well, I wanted to give it some context. The content today we're going to talk about is largely focused on how we can be more responsive in helping our students and then our employer community through measuring the skills that are needed for the workforce. And I've been leading up with COABE a new initiative called Behind Every Employer. So it's not just Tyson, it's a group of employers really wanting to be full partners in the adult education efforts. And I was just earlier hearing about Career Up and kind of the new elements you guys are expanding. And I really want to applaud you in that effort first and say that the content today from Judy and myself, it's going to be really well timed and really help you position well for tooling and retooling your services to meet that employment demand that our learners have and that our employers need. So really appreciate those efforts. Judy, I'll let you tell us a little bit about what's going on at World Ed and your context of things.
All right, thanks, Anson. Hi again. Yes, Judy Mortrude with World Education's U.S. Division, which is a group of people seeking to advance educational equity through supporting adult education systems and policies and practitioners like you. Some of you may remember me from my time at the Center for Law and Social Policy, or CLASP, where I also worked on WIOA implementation. And before that, I was a teacher and a local program administrator and a state program director in the state of Minnesota. So I've been doing this adult ed stuff for a long time. And our objectives today, and even though we've got a ton of content and a lot of slides, I just couldn't resist doing a little bit of a trip down memory lane to kind of recap some of the work we've all done together and that you've done through WIOA implementation. Your work has really put DC in a prime position for these new opportunities in the national reporting system. And at the end of this presentation, we hope you feel even more confident in planning and documenting measurable skill gain types 3 through 5, and that you'll discover, some new ideas in Anson's presentations of national IE&T and workplace education programs. Next slide. So going back to April of 2014, that's pre-Workforce Innovation and Opportunity Act, and DC, through this Appleseed report, set out a strategy to connect adult learners to career pathways and highlighted many of the adult ed providers in DC, your work at Academy of Hope, and so others might eat, who were developing these strategies that we were starting to call career pathways. Next slide. Going back even further, the DC Appleseed report reflects a lot of this innovative thinking that was happening in the early 2000s as our old law, the Workforce Investment Act, WIA reauthorization conversations were taking place. This is a 2009 report from the Center for American Progress. It's called Working Learners, and it was really trying to call for this change from our reactive urgent care type of workforce development system where people lose a job, you help them get a job, they do the job, they lose the job, to a model of much more proactive career development where adults work and learn and earn. This is before we were using the term career pathway, but it really is about that shift from labor market exchange to proactive, sustained support. I always thought of this as like the wellness model for workforce development.
Like that.
Next slide. So in these years, practitioners were really innovating in the career pathway space through philanthropic investments like shifting gears and accelerating opportunities that focused on adults with foundational skill needs. And there were some enormous investments, right, in the last recession, things like the health profession opportunity grants, the TACT grants, where we were really seeking, transformational change in the way we did education and workforce development for people in our systems. And there was so much of this, so much Microsoft Smart Art, right? You suffered through a lot of these graphics, but this visual really tried to represent a career pathway as the series of well-connected education and training programs resulting in credentials with labor market value, right? Including intensive support services, quality work experiences, employment services that serve target populations through these multiple entry and exit points, right? And connect progressively over time. Higher levels of education, higher levels of employment, family sustaining wage. And of course, it's a vast oversimplification of the work, but it really did try to encapsulate that vision. And next slide. And then, hooray, 2014, July 2014, we get career pathway in federal legislation, right? Workforce Innovation and Opportunity Act gives us this definition, reflecting all of that work that you all and other people in the country have been doing. The same definition over time gets built into the Higher Education Act for ability to benefit funds that allow people without a high school diploma to access federal student aid. And then most recently was built into the Perkins Career Technical Education Act, the Strengthening CTE for the 21st Century Act. So 3 big federal laws that mean to advance equity in education, and they're all using this definition of career pathway. And of course, tucked inside this definition in Section D, right, is the definition of IENT. In WIOA, IENT is required to be part of a career pathway program, and career pathway programs are about organizing for acceleration. So that part E, I always like to highlight, especially now, right? COVID learning loss is making this accelerate, don't remediate, a mantra across educational systems. And again, you all are ahead of the game because of the work you've been doing. Next slide. A reminder that WIOA career pathways were also designed to be supported by a whole variety of other levers in the legislation, right? We have shared planning across the 6 core programs. The state has to put in a unified or combined plan. Co-enrollment, which is also something DC has been actively developing plans for. And then really critically, shared accountability, right? So we saw this as a chance for our core partners, those core partners listed across the top, to operationalize measurable skill gain, right? Measurable skill gain is the opportunity to take advantage of interim progress measures, things you measure while you're serving somebody. And a lot of our partners in Title I, other than youth, had not done that before. They had really only taken performance measures after people left their program. So this was really an opportunity for us to work together and design models that leverage that system. Okay, a little bit more memory lane. You might remember these. This, I think, was maybe a 2017 professional development session we all did together on IENT, containing the legislated definition of IENT, right, over there on the right, as these 3 components: adult education, workforce preparation, workforce training, happening contextually, concurrently, integrated set of outcomes, right? We unpacked all of that as the definitions became more clear to us. We started unpacking what all of that meant. And I spent a lot of time evangelizing that IENT was a lot more than IBEST. It could be many different things because this is a broad definition. So the next slide, you were all such good sports as I made you draw giant Venn diagrams on Post-it notes, right, and put them on the wall. So this is an example of a transportation and logistics program out of Illinois that read adult education skills contextualized to transportation. In yellow, the workforce preparation skills, right? Those things we had been doing in adult education for many years, but now we're really called out to be part of this program. And then in blue, the workforce training complement, right? In this case, a CDL license and endorsements. So that was one kind of IENT. The next slide, Anson, this is your competitor. This is Golden Plump up in Minnesota, right? We were doing a lot of ESL workplace learning projects that could fit the IENT model, contextualizing English language learning. And then next slide, connecting that to a production technician certification, a program done, a 16 credit program done in partnership with a local community college. So just making the case that there is a lot of a lot of room inside that definition of IE&T for innovation and experimentation. Next slide. So IE&Ts, career pathways, they take partnership, they take putting together these programs that really shift not only that one course, but they shift your practice, they shift your culture in your overall programming, and that takes work. But now in 2020, we finally started getting some gold standard research, some evidence that shows our efforts are worth it. This research, which you can find on links or at that link below, was mandated actually within WIOA, covered 45,000 adults in 9 states, documented the positive impacts of IE&T in increasing credentials and certifications and licensing completion, as well as short-term employment. So it lets us have this answer, why IE&T, the answer is it works, right? And it works better than what we used to do. So having this What Works Clearinghouse Institute of Educational Sciences research is just sort of our seal of approval, and we can confidently say IE&T is an evidence-based strategy, showing that we can rely on research in adult education and not just on our sort of professional wisdom. Couple slides of data. There's more and more IE&T happening across the country. This is from program year 2018. You can see DC way over there on the right, almost matched by Palau, which is what PW stands for. You're really over 50% of your service in PY 2008 IE&T. You'll never have the numbers of California because we're not California and DC, but you definitely have the intensity, right? The intensity of the service model represented in your data, which is terrific. Getting toward performance, slide 16. One big impediment to doing this new work, right, is that we were not being incentivized through our performance accountability system. Measurable skill gains, those interim progress measures, right, that adult education sort of lived and died on, were still largely pre-post test measures. And one of the reasons, next slide, is that when WIOA gave us the 5 measurable skill gain types, next slide, Anson, which you can see listed here, right? And there are 3 in type 1, and Anson's going to go through a lot of this with more detail, but those are the 5 measurable skill gain types that WIOA introduced to us. Next slide. As further regulation came down, we realized that WIOA Title II restricted us to just type 1 and type 2 for our negotiated performance targets, meaning you could capture the others, but you weren't really getting credit for them in your performance target setting with the federal government. And so then from the government, your state government down to the local provider, those measures were just not meaning as much. 2 other kind of context, next slide, right? We got the pandemic while all this discussion was going on, and the pandemic really revealed what a house of cards we had built in adult education when states and programs didn't even think they could serve participants because they couldn't pre-test them, and they certainly didn't know how to measure gains without post-tests. This provisional placement is still the law of the land until it gets pulled back. So we are still operating in this space because of COVID. But while this provisional placement and other discussions were happening, we also got the final ruling on a discussion that Anson and I have been having for a long time with a lot of people. And that's the next slide. We got the opportunity to use all of the measurable skill gain types in WIOA Title II. Anson and I worked with a lot of practitioners and advocates around this process, but long story short, we've got all 5. We've got all 5 in special situations in IE&T and in workplace adult education and literacy. And there's a new NRS tip sheet, and then you also received for this webinar the new LACES guidance that talks about documenting these. So my last slide is just to say hooray. DC is really in great shape to demonstrate its effectiveness in this new world, as your data already shows. When that NRS change happened, it was January of 2021. And it was an option to report these new measurable skill gain types this program year. It's a requirement next program year. And I can tell you there weren't many states ready to report this data this year, but DC was. And as a result, you blew through your 47% negotiated target to hit 55.32% because you included those three other measurable skill gain types. And that second part here, you did even more remarkably, I think, in the distance education again, which became even more necessary in the pandemic, and you were able to show the value of your work through the data, which is often very hard to do. All right. Turning it to you, Anson.
You betcha. So first, I want to applaud the performance there. Fantastic, because it gives us a great context for what I'd like to share with you and talk about. Really so excited to work with you today and talk about the advancement opportunities for our learners and helping them meet their career goals and their advancement goals. And I really want to hear your thoughts as we walk through this, but I really kind of want to go through the whys, the hows, the whats of what has changed and put along a lot of emphasis on what you as administrators also need to think of. It's not just a technical change in terms of understanding the policy, but there's really a pretty deep administrative context that I want to share with you so you can start to prep around that area. And some of you are probably already experiencing that and building around it. So I was in Texas when we rolled out these MSGs back in 2016. We rolled out all the MSGs in adult education. We couldn't report three of them, but it's Texas, and the feds are kind of a distant notion in our minds sometimes. So we wanted to move forward because we saw the vision that the framers of WIOA had, and really wanted to exercise a lot of that flexibility and integrate with our workforce partners. So that was a big system, 100,000 students and 6,000 teachers and staff that I rolled this out. And I really was doing this personally in terms of policy and professional development because I thought I could learn the most by really getting in the weeds with our providers and helping them out. So got a good bench of support for you today, and then I've been working with others like Judy across the years really on some of these elements and refining them. But we see this fella here, he's from Fort Worth, Texas, getting his high school equivalency, and we think, we have these academic goals for many of our students, but we know a lot of them come in and they're not really looking for an EFL gain. They're looking for other types of thing in adult education. And I look at her and I think, man, she's got some objectives beyond just pure academics in her life, but are we able to measure them? And now we are, and that's the great thing there. So the academics are critical, but I think, really helping keeping an eye on what those academics lead to, what is the real goal that a student comes back to us looking for, because it's typically an advancement goal in their life situation in terms of economics. And the IET, IENT model and workplace models really help advance that. So now we have this opportunity to capture a wide range of different activities in terms of reportable performance and our services, our outcomes, all the programs that you're delivering. We can get full credit for kind of that wide range of things, and it gets us out of this situation of really being constrained by telling that story of student performance and student success. And that's the real opportunity sitting for us. So I always tell the programs I work with at Tyson, which are AFLA providers across the country, the more you can build your bench of knowledge and expertise on this performance, really the more creative and flexible you'll be able to build your services and bring comfort to your staff that they are going down the right direction, because our teachers and our instructors, they really like strong leadership and guidance, and you can only do that if you know your stuff, if you really got your house in order in terms of those things. And then you really can start to see things flourish. If people feel constrained, you're not going to get the innovation that you really want. So let's look a little bit about making sure we're on the same foundation here on some fundamentals Judy began that discussion. I just want to come back because we do have some new folks on here. But really, it's a big shift from a world focused on really what I would say is learning outputs, getting an EFL gain, getting a GED or something, to moving into a world of real world outcomes, economic driven outcomes. And that is a big shift. And it's a welcomed one because, few students come in and say, hey, I'm here to make an EFL gain. They come in because they want to keep a job or advance in a job, or maybe retool for a new job because they can't do their old job, or their old job has disappeared in the community. And so it's really getting us back to that traction point. Judy showed you this image, and I want to return to this just to be clear that from the onset, we're really increasing, doubling the amount of different types of options, but they're also denser options. And what I mean by that is there's a lot more decision making that has to happen. A lot of it you can do up front, but having that clear administrative path is going to be really, really important. And the other thing I would stress is that the 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 context for these three new options, the ones that are in dark there, is just IET and workplace literacy programs. So the Department of Ed didn't open up these options for all learners, which is what Judy and I really wanted in our heart, but they said, hey, these are most applicable to workplace and IET models. And I'll tell you a little bit more about why that is in just a second. So here's what they look like, and we're going to walk through each of these in some detail, but I want to give you the context also of implementation and what it looks like. And I think that is going to really help you situate it into the work that you're doing. I'll refer to these as the table does, and I recommend folks, I think if you go back to slide 20, you can print this out and give it to your staff and have them put that in their cubicles, in their classrooms, on their walls, because you're getting into an area where quick reference and reminders is really important, because it's a brave new world in terms of some different dynamics. And I see that, early in implementation, oftentimes the people on the front line, slow down when they get confused or unsure, and you want to try to find easy desk aids like this that can help them get this stuff in their eyes, in their line of sight. So let's talk about what the context was. Why did they choose IET and workplace literacy? And one thing I wanted to say is, like, these aren't new MSGs. They are new for reporting performance in adult ed, but they've been around since WIOA was codified, and our workforce partners definitely have been using them. They're much less standardized, and I think what we have in terms of guidance from the Department of Education is what we're going to get. I don't think we're going to get much more guidance. So your leadership there in the district and program directors, you pretty much have everything you need to really build that policy and build your local procedures. And what that means is there's some areas where you're going to have to make some decisions, and I want to kind of help you understand what those are. A lot of states I see right now are still waiting for more. They like it's funny. Adult educators don't like to be spoon fed, but when they're kind of thrust into a brave new world, they are looking for the spoon sometimes. And definitely, for sure, I think we've got what we're going to get from the Department of Education, and it's sufficient. It really is sufficient. I'm going to stress a lot on compliance too. Your district office folks are very focused on that. I'm a former state director, but I also know that the enthusiasm of your local services and your teachers is really increased when they feel like they're doing the right thing and documenting it well. They're really used to doing that with post-tests and pre-tests and all of that. This is taking them into some new areas, and the more you can build their confidence on how to document, the more uptake you're going to see on service delivery. There's some documents here that you'll have in your PowerPoint that you can click on and go to. these are the core foundational documents, and everything that you're going to hear from me is coming out of one of these. There's not a lot of improvisation going on. So it's out there. If you're a policy nerd like me, yeah, you can dig in all you want and look at a lot of this stuff. And this is what your district office folks are probably sleeping with next to their bed sometimes when they're trying to come up with that policy. So let's look at the definitions. I'm a real policy nerd, and I really like to go into the textual criticism of what the law says, and that's what you're going to see from me today, so that we know, like, this is what it says and this is how to implement. But when you look at the definitions, I always found this surprising. IET and then workplace literacy, which we'll look at. When you look at the purpose, like, what is the purpose of IENT? Well, it's twofold. It's educational and career advancement. Now we've been measuring the educational advancement for years, post tests, high school equivalency, transition to post secondary, but we have not had the opportunity to really focus on that career advancement measure, and that's what these three new measurable skills gains bring us. And then when you look at workplace literacy, this one really hits you in the face. To improve the productivity of the workforce. So it doesn't say, workplace literacy is to increase test scores or to increase academic gains. It's a productivity measure. That's a real business word. And productivity is measured in workplace productivity measures. And that's what the new measurable skills gains help us capture. So with your new career up model and your expansion into working more with businesses, you're going to be able to speak right to where the business is looking in terms of their performance. Productivity measures, safety measures, retention measures, these kind of things. So that's what gets me really excited about this. And over here at Tyson Foods, we're just thrilled about the breakthrough and being able to report these things, because it really helps our adult education services do what we'd like them to do. And then the one last definition, if you look at, you go back to measurable skills gains, and remember, it is related to, it's a beautiful definition, really. It's broad, documenting academic, technical, occupational, or other forms of progress. So they just open the door wide open, saying any kind of progress here, essentially, towards a credential or employment. So these new types that we're using in adult ed really help us hit all those dimensions in the definition comfortably. So I find that just real comforting, and we're getting right to the letter of the law, which is fantastic. Okay, let's look a little bit about the context and how are you going to implement this. And I want you, if you're an administrator, this is where, put the coffee cup down, take some notes, because we're going to come back to this at the end. But the administrative context is critical for success. And having done this in Texas, I have seen it all. It's a huge system. We started in 2016, and it was a full-size Texas rodeo for a few years there, getting to understand what implementation would look like, which was half the battle. This is a brave new world. Like, how is this going to be applied? How will teachers respond? How will we document this stuff? And then once we started to really learn that, building policy and building some practice and best practice and training around these elements. So that's your leadership roles. The teachers are there to teach and instruct. And as administrators, we've really got to give them the tools to do that effectively, so they're not questioning things, and which will slow down their enthusiasm. So I always think of it as, we've got some constraints and we've got some great opportunities. And the constraints are, we've got multiple measurable skills gains options for students. Now, you might think that doesn't sound like a constraint, but it is, because multiple options means you got to make a decision. And you've got to make a decision on what is the most appropriate MSG for the student. Prior to WIOA, and even over the last few years, there wasn't a lot of decision making. Give them a post test. Give them a post test. And you had to decide when to give it and how many hours and which form and all that. But that was a pretty narrow band of decision making. Now things have really gotten much more dense in terms of that process. And that's what I want you to think of as we go through the measures. And then at the end, we're going to kind of reflect on this a little bit more because the opportunity is huge. Um, we've got upfront forecasting that can really help us, if we do it right, forecast where a student is most likely going to earn a gain, document that, and then reduce some of the things that maybe we've been doing, like post-testing. Many states, Texas would be one of them, Tennessee's another one that I've worked with, and in Nebraska, or not Nebraska, Kansas, they're saying, hey, we're going to really reduce this post-testing burden, which is a burden, because we're capturing the gains in other ways. And that's a decision that you guys will want to be looking at in terms of, like, what are you going to do with your exit measures? Are you going to require two, like some states are doing, or just one? And definitely a decision there for the district level folks. Um, so the context for administration, I'm going to walk through a framework that was used and built by a group that do a lot of great research on community colleges, but it's a good way to understand just really the student experience. And I think of it this way. So think about the implementation of performance across this continuum. You've got the students coming in and they're thinking, I'm here. I got a flyer at the laundromat, and I got this goal. I want to do this goal. We do testing at the entry process. We gather information on them. We do the WIOA profile. Um, and then while they're in classes, the progress is really the classes and the activities. And they're checking in their mind, is what I'm learning, does it relate to my goals? Is this, am I getting what I came for? I'm a busy person. I've got 2 jobs or 3 coming to school. So this is the progress area is huge for us. And then they finish in some way. They're finished, or they can transition or something. But it's typically been really narrowly defined around testing and testing. And the system is largely built for the last 20, 30 years, my whole career, around a pre-test and a post-test, and that's very much in our DNA. And we've expanded in the last few years, and you guys surely have, but it's really in the DNA of that frontline practitioner. And now we're really expanding things into some different ways. But as an administrator, here's where I really want you to pay attention, and we're going to come back to this at the end. But think about who is doing this activity, and then to what extent is it complex? Well, pre and post testing, you may feel like it's complex, but it's really not that complex. You've got test administrators and proctors, and they can pretty much do that work. A lot of it can be done by proctors. And then you've got so much automation now in our testing systems that the guesswork has largely been taken out. When I started, you had to make a lot of decisions about calculating the hours of a student in class and determining the form to use and all those things. So right now, if you're thinking of pre-testing and post-testing, it's very scalable, it's very automated in many ways, and it's very standardized. And what you're going to see with MSGs type 3, 4, and 5, these things get dramatically more complex. And as an administrator, you've got to start thinking, if you haven't already, and you probably have, like, how are we going to really do these things in a way that we're not rushing to the end, or that we become constrained, or that we do it wrong, or that we don't have the documentation? And that's the message I want you to think of right now. And then we're going to move right now into actually what these MSGs are, what do they look like, what are some contexts, and then come back to this dynamic of what does an administrative context look like. And I'm going to share what we heard about in our, what we did in Texas and implemented in our policy that really supported us. So let's look at these MSGs, and I'm going to take them one at a time. And I'll start with MSG type 3, which is one that I really like because of its simplicity. But it's also one where I know there's got to be quite a bit of a context of community college or higher education implementation. And I understand there's not as much of that context in the DC area in terms of a big community college system that's engaged in adult education. So this is one to look forward to as you build that framework within the colleges, because it is simplistic in many ways and very convenient. But this is really not applying any extra work than what is already being done in the higher education context. And what I mean by that is you're essentially using the report card or the official college or higher education's transcript as an evidence piece for the measurable skills gains. So it's a secondary for youth and a post-secondary transcript or report card that shows the student has attended this many hours in an IET, and that they're meeting whatever the state or region's academic standards are, so that they're passing. So that's really simple. If you worked at a college like I used to, you just could print out a transcript, put it in the student file, and you're done. No additional tests having to be given, no post tests being given, no HSCs being given. Really just taking that IET transcript with the training hours, and a lot of discretion is built into this one for the region or the locality. But really focusing on that as your evidence. It's for college credit only, so non-credit college courses don't count. That's a constraint sometimes because so many IETs are built on the non-credit side. But folks are getting excited about this with ability to benefit as a financial aid option and things like that. But I really like this one because of the simplicity of it and the fact that there's really no extra work involved. But there is a lot of state or jurisdiction decision making that has to happen, because depending on what state you're in, credit hours, semesters, quarters, there's a lot of different mutations or permutations of higher education implementation and context. And then really the rate of what is passing is really not as settled in the states. And so the states have to determine what passing is. And we spent a lot of time on that in Texas. So this is one where, should that capacity build in the district in terms of working with the college, then you really have a good MSG situated there. But there is some decision making at the jurisdiction level that at the district office that you're going to have to make related to these things. Here's an example of one. This is actually a program that we have in Nebraska, and they're doing a 12 credit hour load for industrial maintenance. And the students just end up with a report card at the end or a transcript of passing pneumatics classes, passing hydraulics classes, tool safety, and that kind of stuff. Their college credit in Nebraska. And man, that's like the simplest documentation you can get. So I really love the attractiveness of this one. It's not widely used because I think largely because there's not a lot of IETs built on the credit side across the states. So this is type 3. And it's one to kind of park in your mind, but you can see here, wow, not too much administrative burden there for this one. And that seems very attractive to me. But when we move into the next one, the progress milestones or the type 4 measure, here we really get into something that has some more complexity to it. And before I move into this one, I'm going to ask Judy if there's been any questions that we need to address so far. Anything you'd like to say, Judy?
No, we've been having some chat about
Okay.
how things are reported on the NRS, but I think we're getting through that. I think maybe just backing up to that last slide and noting that that report card or transcript, right? That's documentation of the measurable skill gain, and then down there at the far right, you've got the achievement of the recognized post-secondary credential, and they're not the same thing, right? The MSG is that interim progress measure. The recognized post-secondary credential is a WIOA performance measure outside of measurable skill gain.
Yep. In this instance, in Nebraska, it's Metropolitan Community College. So they're actually doing, they have quarters there, so they're doing report cards throughout the year. I just listed one here, but they're getting a 2-year technical certificate. It's basically an 18-month program, so they're getting a technical certificate awarded as their recognized post-secondary credential for college training, and it articulates it's only a few hours away from an associate's degree. Really great value for those students up there in Nebraska. Okay, so let's move on to from the most kind of simplistic reporting, not too, relatively simplistic, to what is probably the most dense and documentation heavy, but it's also the most flexible. So, in life, flexibility often brings complexity. And this one is the one I like the most. So, if I spend too much time on this one, Judy can stop me. But this one brings a lot of opportunity, but it takes a lot more documentation and decision making. And I want to talk about this one because I think for your career up program, this one's going to be really attractive. And when you start working more with businesses, you're going to really be able to cut through the educational red tape and really talk the talk of the business. And I want to give you some good examples of this. So it's got a kind of a convoluted definition. So I'm going to dissect this thing a little bit here. But and I'm going to take, it's got a dependent clause in here. I'm going to take it out. And we're just going to look at the actual sentence, and then we'll come back to that dependent clause, but it distracts from the way the definition is written. But it's satisfactory or better progress report. So the first thing is it's satisfactory or better, meaning it meets or exceeds the expectations. And it's not necessarily quantified. It's not necessarily a score. Could be, but it doesn't have to be a score. It has to be a progress report, documented progress. So, like I said, it's not a test, and we love tests in education. It's a progress report. Is the student progressing along some sort of established milestone? So, really deliberate language here that Congress used. Milestone is not a term we use in education much. They use it in training oftentimes for things, but in adult education for sure. But I think it was purposely used, very deliberate. And it's established, meaning it's agreed upon, some sort of milestone, some sort of accomplishment that clearly defines progress, and it includes some sort of documentation because it's established. So really dissecting the language there, but who is doing the establishment and defining it? An employer or the training provider who's providing training. So here is where we're really getting to the employer as the customer and the one that's driving what success is. And that's why I find it so attractive. You don't know how many times, Judy and I and others, you guys too, have met with a business, talked to them, and then you get this sick feeling in your stomach because you got to talk to them about, okay, we got to administer these tests, we got to do a CASAS test or a TAVE test or whatever, and they're usually very accommodating, but then when the time comes, sometimes frustration ensues just because of the time, and it's totally unrelated to what the business is looking for. So we can really put that world out of our mind and really get to saying to the business, what does progress look like? What do you want these workers to accomplish? And it's not driven by a test publisher. It's not driven from an agency. The agency might give you like what kind of documentation you need, but it's driven from the employer or the training provider that's working with the employer. So that's a brave new world for us, and one that I really, really like because it puts us right there in the driver's seat, not wasting the time of the employer or the poor worker that we're trying to, in the past pull off the line or get them off the job to take, a multi-hour test that has nothing to do with their job. So we really cut to the chase from those things. If we go back to this little dependent clause, it begins with such as. So satisfactory or better progress report toward established milestones, such as. So that's just an example. It's not saying it has to be these things. And it gives two really workplace examples, apprenticeships and on-the-job training. But those are just examples, and they're historically really the models that typically were not measured very well by standardized tests. So I always like to tell folks, such as means we're just giving you some examples here. It's not the only things that this applies to. And if you dig deeper into some of that policy I shared later, they really hit this point home and say, like, like the apprenticeship is just one example of a time frame, 1 year. Don't construe this to mean that it can be the only way to do things. In that last sentence here, I love the time frame for the milestone should be established based on the specific facts of the program at issue. So it's really saying go to the specifics of that workplace context, of that IET at the workplace context. So really, really giving us the flexibility, but then you got to like make some decisions about what is this going to look like? How am I going to document it? So the detail in the program memo, one of the documents I shared earlier, flexibility in documentation. Documentation may vary. So they're saying, hey, no one size fits all approaches here. It's customized to the service, appropriate methods based on the service. So again, customizing right to the business needs. And then this one I really like. It must be substantive. Must document substantive skill development. And I want to say a little bit about that because I think that word substantive is very important. And it means it's got to be specific, but it's subjective to some extent. But it must have meaningful effort, substantial. And here you really see that the feds are guarding against easy gains. If a business said, well, I just want everybody to show up for work tomorrow, and that'll be a measurable skills gain for me, that's not substantive. That's very, 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 very weak in terms of a goal. So that substantive is, I always used to tell my providers, like, I can't tell you exactly what it is, but it's got to really be something of substance, some sort of thing that the business says, this is hard for us to get accomplished with our workers. Train them, educate them so they can do it, and you will have accomplished that mission. And so that's substantial. You can tell the business is like, man, we can't get this done alone. We're bringing you in to help us. So there again, some decision making and critical thinking. But when I talked to the feds about this for several years, trying to convince them to open these up for adult ed, Cheryl Keenan, her main question about any of this stuff was really this element of how do we make this so that it isn't so easy that everybody in this employer-based model is getting a gain. And I thought that was a great observation, and I dug back in and said, like, I think this word here is really helpful for us. And yes, it is a bureaucratic term of art, no doubt about it. But that's what this stuff's all about. All the great things in policy are typically in the footnotes or in the words, of course, and sometimes single words. So let me give you some examples. Some of them from Tyson, some of them not. So this is an industrial maintenance program that we're doing in several states actually right now, where we're implementing these measures. And in industrial maintenance, they have to do things such as lockout, tagout measures, meaning they have to make sure a machine doesn't operate when they go in and start working on it because it could hurt somebody. So there's a whole process for that. And understanding that isn't critical because you could turn the machine on while someone's inside of it, repairing it and kill them or hurt them. So LOTO is a super important thing. And when you're working with limited English proficient workers, you've got to make sure they understand these procedures, detecting workpiece defects, determining accuracy, math related to measuring. In this context, in one of the plants, it has to do with tortilla dough. They make tortillas at one of our plants, and they don't want waste. They want to make great tortillas for America. And so these accuracy, they take samples off the line to measure them and make sure it's coming out thick, the same thickness, and all those kind of things. So a lot of embedded math skills and stuff in this, but it's very customized. And the last thing I really love on here, this measure allows for a simple pay raise to be evidence of a skill gain. So students get a pay raise because they've gone through training, they've learned another skill or maybe been promoted. Just documentation of that pay raise, which can be verification from the employer. Yes, Anson got a raise. I'm signing off on this. Ample documentation for the measure, and no test or anything given in an instance like that. So here's what it looks like. Since you have multiple methods, there's different time periods where individuals may make the skill gain. Some may gain it based on a progress report. I'm going to give you an example of a progress report, what that might look like. Some may get that wage gain, and they're all driving towards this certified production technician credential from the Manufacturing Skills Council. So a lot of flexibility here. Let me look at this report here. So remember, this is an example that I got from Massachusetts, made a few tweaks to it. But this is really your document for success, for showing that the individual student has made a skill gain. Down the left side, those tasks are the ones that the business defined. You listened to them, you took good notes, they gave you this information. And then in the middle column, you're going to document how you're going to measure it. Is it going to be through shadowing? Is it going to be through performance-based? What's it going to be? And then at the end there, you see that you can document, did the student attain it? Are they still in progress, or did they not attain it? So this would be what you would have in the student file. It's very customized. So it's attractive in that it's super customized and you're not wasting anybody's time, and the employer, this is what the employer came in for. And this is what the worker wants to see progress on, right? They want to do well on their job, and they want that. This speaks their language. A post test doesn't. But you can see also embedded, there's quite a bit of documentation that has to happen, and that's what I back to the administrative piece. We've got to be thinking through, like, who's going to do this, where, who's going to do the documentation, who's going to meet with the employer. So you're starting to see this administrative context is a little bit more dynamic and thicker than typically. So do we have a question?
Yes, I'm going to jump in. Well, Mary's got a question. Yeah. So Mary, you can unmute yourself, but I'm going to also have a question.
Yeah.
So you've been saying employer, but also for MSG type 4, right? Or training provider. This could be the training provider who has come up with these skills that are listed in this left-hand column.
Absolutely, yes. Definitely, it's an or. So the employer or training provider, because sometimes in these contexts, the training provider knows best. They know what these skills are, for sure. So yes, what was Mary's question?
Mary, have you unmuted? Can you unmute yourself, Mary? Or do you want to type it in? There we go. Hi, Mary. Oh, we don't hear you, though.
Mary, you should be able to unmute yourself.
That's Stacy. Can you do it, Stacy?
Yes, I did. But someone said it may be her. She's having some other issues because she popped in and out.
We can come back for sure. I'd love to hear that question on substantive gain, because that's a really rich term there. And Mary, if you can type it up and send it over, or all right, she's going to get back in a minute. Excellent. So let's move on. Mary, we're going to come back to you. Don't let us forget. And I want to give you all some more examples. So this is a workplace hospitality program. And this was down on the beach in Texas. And here you see multiple different methods of earning a gain. And remember, you need one per year for performance, for federal performance. But getting multiple ones is always good. If you miss one, you might get the next one for student performance. But here you've got a combination. They were fully automating to a order system that was going to be online, so there needed to be some data entry support, and some of the workers were moving into kind of the record keeping and supervisor roles and needed to know how to use a PC. Then there was definitely a contextualized ESL test because this is Texas and we've got a lot of folks that speak Spanish in our restaurants, and the more they speak English, the better customer service and things they can do. So a very customized hospitality ESL test that was customized based on what the business and the training provider came up with together. And then the restaurant itself had a safety exam that they wanted to do in English. They were doing it in Spanish, but and they continued to do it in Spanish, but they wanted to make a gain be the amount of students that could start to transition into the English test. So a great example, very customized for hospitality. You've got a lot of that up in DC, but you can really start getting creative there in really meeting the needs of individuals going into the hospitality program. And then here's a retail customer service example, and then we can come back to some notes in the chat here. And again, financial literacy test at the end, and then a company's contextualized test for customer service. This was at one of our big outlet malls between Austin and San Antonio. And really simply defined, the training was being provided for there was a school that did the training for about 100 different stores in the outlet mall. And so they basically trained retail workers, and the retail workers got hired by all the different little vendors in the outlet mall. But they could standardize, so they could standardize kind of the ESL classes, largely Spanish-speaking residents in that area of the state. And so it was a great way to customize and not add a lot of extra burden. Did we get Mary's question in yet?
Now, can you hear me now?
Yeah, yes, please.
I had to switch computers. Sorry about that, but I get a measurable skill gain. I troubleshoot my problem.
Great.
I want to go back for a second. I'm with Academy of Hope Adult Public Charter School, and we're an educational institution and a training provider. So we have situations where, in terms of goal setting, there are those students, for example, we have a nursing assistant program. And most of the students want to, take the program, do their clinicals, get licensed, and then get a job in the healthcare field. But we have some who really want to take the class, not so much to be working in the field, but they say they're older. I have someone sick at home. I need to work with them. So they may not take the licensing exam. Can that be considered a measurable skill gain if we're able to track their progress?
Sure. I mean, I think you're going. I love the context. First off, that definitely is something I've run across before in my career with folks that are dealing with long-term care in their own home or in their family. But yeah, it's about, and a lot of the measures would be some of the same measures that the individuals taking the actual official exams would be. Because you're still doing prep for those exams, you're still learning the competencies. And so, we often think in that context of like, the written test and then the, performance-based test, sometimes in a long-term care facility or something like that. And those are real comfortable stages of skill gain that we go, oh yeah, we can see a real measure there. We have a score or whatever. But there's all kinds of learning that happens in the interim. It's measurable skills gain progressions. So I think defining it could be something as simple as a prep test for the written test, which the instructor is probably giving, and things like that. So I think it's something that you use your discretion. Is it substantive? I think you could definitely find the substantive piece in there, and really customize it. And then maybe in that course where some of the students are going to sit for the certification, some aren't. Maybe the ones that are sitting for the certification have, 5 opportunities to earn a gain based on some customized tests and the official tests, and then the ones that aren't sitting for the official tests have 3 opportunities. So yeah, I think you got a great context there. It's a great question.
Yeah, because we can document it because they're taking quizzes and tests throughout. it's sometimes, I hate to say it, and I don't know if Audrey's on the phone, but sometimes some of our older learners, you know, the skills can be challenging, but they go through all of the competencies. So we can document that they are making these certain milestones. So that could really help us, because
absolutely.
it's not a lot, but it's a few. And I believe success is defined so many different ways.
Absolutely.
Okay.
Christy, for sure, on the micro credentials, I see Christy's question, and I'll let you go. Absolutely. I mean, that's a very convenient one. Typically, the micro credential is substantive. There's some depth of skill there, and it's easy to document. So that's a nice one. It kind of gets us into the comfort zone of something we can put in the student file for success and for measurement and compliance, because that's what I always ask myself, what am I putting in the student's file?
So I'm gonna hog this again, and I have one more question. We also offer a CompTIA and IT program, and I got a question yesterday from the instructor. There is a student, they're taking, it's an introductory fundamentals certification in CompTIA, and then if they pass it, they move on to A+ certification. There is one or two students that really don't have the knowledge. They probably won't make it to A+, but they're making these document in progress. I mean, you know, understanding how to open up Zoom links and things like that. So I guess what you're saying is, if we can document that progress, whatever it is, and I'll talk to our OSSE folks about that, then that's a MSG.
Yeah, I think, I mean, here's how this works typically. It's a dialogue with your OSSE folks, because and it's a very good dialogue to have, because oftentimes the state folks, or in your case OSSE, they don't know all the instances. They're not the local practitioners. They need to hear this stuff to build their depth of knowledge.
Yeah.
And then you need to kind of have that dialogue on, is it substantive? What would the documentation be? Is this a one-time occurrence for this one student, or is this something that we see as a trend, as a place where students get to this point, they hit a wall, but they have gotten to this point, and right now they're not getting any kind of credit for that, because your context is great, the CompTIA and all that gets really complicated. Not everybody's going to get to that finish line, so you want to get somewhere down the interim. Judy, you had something you wanted to add.
No, just exactly that. I mean, sometimes when Anson and I give this presentation, we have this caveat slide that are like, we're not Anson, you're not the state director here, remember? Right? So the state director has a lot of a lot of say in this. But I think, as I understand it, OSSE is going to be, soliciting this input from practitioners in DC, and what are the planned MSGs that you want to build into your IENT, or that you already have in your IENT and workplace education program. So yeah, it definitely should be a bit of a dialogue, and then OSSE will craft some guidance. So.
Absolutely. Yeah, I would just close that little discussion by saying, I've worked with at least 7 states on this. They're all doing it differently. Some are being a lot more prescriptive than others in areas where I don't really think they should be prescriptive. And what they're doing is really boxing themselves into having to answer a million questions. Because if you start having to, in a big state, if you start having to approve every darn IET measurable skills gain, I mean, I knew in Texas I was never going to be able to do that with thousands and thousands of students. But they think at the onset they can do that because they're used to doing that for post testing. And nothing says you have to do that. So I think they will learn just on the kind of burden side that they're restricting some of the creativity. And anybody that's a state leader or a district leader, you don't know everything, and you learn as much from your providers on this kind of stuff, because they're in the trenches, they're in the weeds. So I think that dialogue that you guys are having, starting with things like today, is super instrumental in success.
Anson,
okay.
And so let me add to this.
Sure.
The AFE team we already have some thoughts around progress towards milestones, really tapping into a lot of the work that the IENT providers did at the onset of the grant competition. So we really don't really need to reinvent the wheel relative to the criteria for this MSG type, in that we're really looking at linking it to the information in their grant applications, linking it to the ONET competencies that they already identified, the occupations they already said they were going to prepare customers for, so they don't have to reinvent the wheel. So, you know, we're leaving, there's a lot of room for flexibility, because we're going to tap into what they've already done and not add additional work for them.
Yeah.
So we'll flesh that out and talk to them about that further. But trust and know, I'm always about, you guys did some extensive grant application. You know, your grant applications are the capital BOMB, as far as I'm concerned. You did great work. What, you know, as far as reporting, you already got everything that you need right there, and that's where we're going to start from. Thanks.
Love it. That's some steady leadership, and I appreciate that feedback. And if you're seeing it in those applications, then that's where you really can tell when people got their stuff and they don't got their stuff. And it sounds like this group you're real confident in. So this is great stuff, and I appreciate that collegial discussions you guys have with each other, because that's so critical.
We take it well.
Yeah, absolutely. So let's look at the last measurable skills gain type here, the skills progression. This one is one more nuance, and a very important one. When we saw this one as being very popular in Texas as we rolled out our IET programs. And then we're going to look at the administrative. We're going to come back to that administrative piece and then go to questions. So type 5 MSG is successful passage of an exam. So we're back to this comfortable area of an evidence-based exam or test. And I say comfort area because, you know, teachers like things they can touch and see and put in a file, and they know have a lot of research behind them. That type 4 MSG sometimes kind of gets people jittery just because it takes a lot of critical decision making on some things that are a little bit more ambiguous until you define them. And then we give a lot of tests, especially in our IENT programs, that are workforce tests. And now we can get some credit for those things. So I always stress the exam-based piece of this, and it's required for a particular job or occupation. So it's what does it take for that job or for that certification for that job, in terms of interim tests or exams. And it can be, there's an option here of a test required for occupations or progress in obtaining skills, and then some curious words related to work-related progress and these benchmarks, trade-related benchmarks, much like the milestones term, kind of this ambiguous term that can be flexibly interpreted. But I love it because it really tells us there's got to be some sort of standard, some sort of target, some sort of level. But we're not going to tell you exactly what it is. So we're, you know, Congress leaving up some flexibility there.
I've heard teachers say, well, while the people are on a break, I'm doing this. Or while they going to lunch, I'm doing that.
Okay, we are,
well, you got to have a break,
individual.
but we don't have lunch.
I don't know if that was referring to the session or not.
Not in the schedule, because you can't make it right.
That may be a side conversation. And then they give us this optional, one example could be such as a knowledge-based exams. So it's an interesting definition. It's packed with terms, much like the other one. And so I think looking at those terms closely, again, real important to dissect those. But you basically got an exam or test-based system of measurement that's a progress across a continuum of attaining skills for the job or for the training and certification related to the job. And I think this one best tells its story through some examples, which I'll go through here. So this goes back to our industrial maintenance program. This is another type of program that's being run. This one's in Kansas. and at one of our plants, and they're taking the certified production technician exam. And if you know about the MSSC, or Measurable Skill Manufacturing Skills Council CPT certification, it has 4 tests built into it: a safety test, a quality test, a manufacturing test, and a maintenance test. Any one of those could be your measurable skills gain, because they're tests that are showing progress towards a credential required for the job or certification. You only need 1 a year, so passing any of those would get you the MSG. Of course, passing them all gets you the recognized post-secondary credential. So it's it's a really good example of one, because this is a widely used assessment. If you're in the manufacturing world, I know y'all probably don't have as much manufacturing going on in DC as other places do, but it does exemplify a great example. And it shows the student, the students typically come into this program, and they are very excited to pass each of those 4 tests. But in the past, it didn't really count much for them until we started being able to capture those in the NRS. And so now we can really kind of give them that credit for getting an MSG while they're moving towards that credential. Here's another one in construction trades. You probably have plenty of construction going on around DC. This is one I like to show this one because it crosses a program year. So one of my things that I could do another whole hour or 2 on is, the program year and periods of participation. But here we have a period of participation that crosses a program year. And there's 4 different benchmarks leading to a college certificate, or the NCCER, if you know that, a core credential, which is a construction credential from the National Center for Construction Education and Research. But here, remember, we need an MSG each program year. So they get the first one by passing an OSHA safety test in June. But then they can get one of the others: forklift certification, the CASAS workplace learning system math test. This isn't your regular CASAS test that we are familiar with, the goals math test. This is another test CASAS produces. They have some fine products that are customized, contextualized rather, for different occupations. And so that would be a great one. Teachers like to give tests. It's something they can put in the file. They feel good about it. And it's relevant. It's relevant to construction. Or they could even include the passage of the core NCCR core certification. So this one got a lot going on there, but it's all dynamic and completely tied to the occupation. And that's what makes this so important. So let's go back and talk about process here, and then we'll get to questions here. Administrative process. And we looked at this earlier, and we looked at our sequence of services and what our students are doing in the way things have been back in the old days, and less so recently, but still a lot of this happening out there with testing and pre-testing. But now we look at this new intake, and we move from something that was somewhat kind of less complicated than where we're moving in with these 3 new MSG options. And so I really want to talk about, like, what does optimal implementation look like in terms of decision making in administration. So one thing, when we look at what we're doing, there's also some new services that I've underlined here. We've got more co-enrollment happening at the beginning with students. We've got the workforce training in your IENTs, internships. We've got employment advancement, continuing ed. So WIOA has thrust us into a lot of new outcomes and services. And now we're measuring them. But when you think about the measurement, think about this progress here. We're still doing some sort of intake and assessments at the beginning. And that helps us give us kind of the baseline of where the students are and what are appropriate services for them. But now we've got these decisions to make in terms of what darn MSG is going to apply for this particular student. And that's what I mean about getting into a much more complicated administrative process. Because if you're dealing with dozens or hundreds of students, um, for the ones that are participating in IET, which you guys is a lot of students and in workplace programs, that's a lot of decision making, individualized. And of course, you can, group if students are in this class, these would be the most appropriate MSGs. But somehow you've got to start this process of sorting in your mind, and I would say documented, what is the path that's going to be most appropriate for the student, much more than testing. And what is the most likely MSG the student is going to earn in that program of study? So you've got multiple options, multiple forms of documentation. Some of it are going to be external exams. Some of these tests, the student goes and takes it third party. You don't even get the results. You've got to ask the student, bring back your test form, so your achievement, so I can put it in the file and document it. So there's a lot of decision making. It can't be the teachers doing all this. There's got to be someone in charge of kind of making sure these things are happening. Because what happens if they don't do that, you get towards the end of the program year and people are scrambling to find documentation, scrambling to figure out what is the best one to apply here, scrambling to give people last minute post tests because they didn't collect the documentation. And so you're really guarding against that hurly-burly of activity that you don't have to go into. But you got to ask yourself, who is going to manage these elements? And it might be multiple people across a process. In Texas, we implemented what we called a planned MSG, which was a MSG that we noted in the student file at the beginning of services. So when we talked to the individual participant and we said, what do you want to do? What are your goals? We looked at their pretest scores, and the providers started documenting. I think this person came in and said they want to get a high school diploma and go to college. Well, then we're going to have MSG for high school equivalency be their gain. This student came in and said, well, I want to get into a welding program. Well, we're going to look at the American Welding Society certification tests as a measurable skills gain. It was noted in their file. So when you go back and look 3 months later, as the student is finishing, you can remember what was kind of the initial thought. Maybe it's changed, and that planned MSG can change. That's what that last bullet says. But you've got something to base decision making on. And this thing that we implemented about 2017, really, it was like a wild idea of mine. But I saw the problems we were trying to address. And it really helped us identify and document this in the student record, because the person doing intake back in January is not necessarily the same person that's doing, the performance at the end of the year or at the end of the semester or whatever your periods are. And then it could be referenced by the instructor during instruction. And then you had the shared responsibility and decision making. So it wasn't all falling on a test proctor. It wasn't all falling on the test administrator. So this is that deeper administrative context. It reduces this last minute guesswork. You get some continuity there, and it really allows a lot more time to gather documentation. So to end there, some pro tips, and then we get to questions. Get strong processes. It sounds like you've got a good bench of support to do that. Keep building. Include multiple staff and work with that state office team. They seem like just fantastic folks, and collaborative. And then think about compliance. I'm a compliance hound, because I don't want to get audited, and because I know if my team feels like they're doing the right thing, that they're going to do more of the right thing. And then include the student in this discussion. At the end of the day, if you're cutting out a lot of pre and post test or post testing for students, you want them to know how they're doing, because a lot of times students want to know their test score. How am I doing in class? Because they've been coming for years. Well, now we could say, hey, you're not going to take a post test. There's going to be something else here we're going to do, and this is what it is. And that gets them excited typically, because you're really going right to their heart in terms of what they came in for at the beginning. And know your stuff, know the details, know the documentation. That gives confidence to everyone on your teams that they're doing things correctly, and it allows them to thrive. So let's get to some questions here. It's been a good discussion here so far from some of you guys. You got really articulate questions. Anybody? For me or Judy?
And again, you can unmute yourselves or go ahead and type your questions into the chat.
I have a question, if that's okay.
Mm-hmm.
So it's back to the option 3, the first one we talked about. And I was thinking about when we were talking about crossing program years for that option 5. And I just wanted to get a little bit of a better understanding. I'm not sure if other programs are the same, but it's rare for us that a student would be co-enrolled in part or full-time college. They would usually matriculate after. So is that one something that we would be able to use in future program years, or that only applies to the program year that they're enrolled with us and that we're monitoring their progress then?
Yeah, I mean, the performance is only recorded for the period for which the individual is a participant in your program. So once they go 90 days with no service from you, so say they've gone on to college and you have no service related to them, after 90 days, they exit. That's the definition of basically the program exit. And so, yeah, once they go to college, they're probably achieving all kinds of great stuff, but it really has nothing to do with your services anymore, even though you got them to that point, if I'm understanding your question correctly.
Yes, and I guess I'm
but
just
it
trying
would
to
be
understand what
it would be
option
1C.
like would do. Who might use that?
One more time, Audrey.
Sorry, the question was just trying to understand a little better the new option that we have, number 3, and context that might be used in, that somebody would get that college transcript and use that as a measurable skills gain. Is it that you're just purely co-enrolled? I was just trying to get a context.
Yes. So they would be co-enrolled. Here it is again, in the program, and it'd be an IET. These are typically IETs. They're co-enrolled. You're providing some basic education, and then the higher education institution, often a community college or something, is providing the technical credit level adult or workforce training piece. Judy, you were going to add to that.
Well, I was just going to flag, if you go back up to slide 17, the list of all the MSGs, there is an MSG type 1C, which is post-secondary enrollment. That is not dual enrollment. That is not co-enrollment, right? It's when you have actually transitioned somebody. Now, it does say, during the same program year, that contains the date of exit, so that doesn't cross program years either. But that is the direct transition metric rather than the co-enrollment metric.
Yeah. So that would be the one that you would definitely you could plan for. The trick on that one is it's got to be within the program year. But say they exit in January, they exit your services, or their last day is in, say, the end of December. They go 90 days. They go to college early May. Boom. That would be your type 1C post-secondary enrollment measure. Absolutely. Other questions?
But can I ask, this is Mary again on top of Audrey. So let's say, because our program year, if it ends, they finish in June, they want to matriculate to college, but for example, let's say the program year ends. But what if we have their application for college? They've been accepted, but that doesn't work?
No.
Yeah, they have to enroll and actually go to college, be in college. Yeah, that's a big debate actually, about when that little, but it's not just paying for tuition for the next year or something like that as documentation.
No, but I've seen a lot of adult education providers provide sort of, continue services through that transition time, right? With this exact goal in mind, to provide some of that college navigation, help people over that first hurdle, and at that point they are duly enrolled with you and the post-secondary institution. So,
and Audrey, this is Michelle. There is within the next few months or so, there will be a new scholarship opportunity called DC Futures. And the post-secondary education options that will be available to adult learner might help our IENT providers with MSG type 3. We're waiting for that program to be developed and marketed. So stay tuned. Both the DC Futures, the Mayor Scholars, and the Career Up initiatives are going to be beneficial to us relative to the MSG, the 3 new MSG types. So trust and know that we are threading the needle with all new initiatives in alignment with the work that you're already doing, and going to make sure that there's, as best as possible, a fit with the new initiatives to accommodate the work that you're doing. So we're way ahead of the game. And we want to make it easy on you and not burdensome at all. So that's the goal.
Great.
Thanks so much, Michelle. That's so good. And thank you, Judy and Anson, for your answers.
Absolutely, absolutely. Anyone else? We got a couple of minutes here left. Well, I'll leave you with just underscoring again that administrative piece. You know, we did this for several years while I was state director, and I felt like from that vantage point, our IETs kind of grew as our schools got more and more confident with capturing the performance. And I would actually tell you that I think IETs early on were hampered by the fact that we were trying to measure a very complex workplace and occupationally focused model with academic tests, and people could not make that leap very successfully because it's a very obscure leap. But the more we kind of built the administrative process, we saw like really this trajectory of IET and workplace program growth just take off because people gained confidence. They figured out that this was in many ways easier, more relevant, more exciting. Giving a bunch of post tests is not very exciting, but going in and working on these kind of measures is. But you've got to figure out, you got to get your house in order in terms of the administration, because it is more difficult sometimes, and it doesn't have to be more difficult. It's really more just dense and takes a little bit of planning, and I saw people just kind of fail because they didn't build that right at the beginning. And so that's why we implemented this planned MSG in our policy in Texas. And like I said, it was kind of a wild idea of mine, really to stem the bleeding on the problems I was seeing, but it ended up really sticking. So I was happy. And I just saw their new policy that came out about a month ago. And they've fleshed it out even more. So the administrative piece is one not to underlook there.
Anson, do you want to put your email that you would?
Yeah, let me put my
Yeah.
email in the chat. You know, I think
right.
I actually did not have it in the
Slide deck.
Slide deck. Yeah,
right,
got so busy with all these images that I left off my name.
So we've come up against time, but we just want you to know that you can certainly reach out to us if you have more questions, and we will make ourselves available. We're excited about the work you do, and happy to keep in touch.
Okay, thank you, Michelle and Judy and team out there. Appreciate everything, and good luck to y'all's work. And maybe we'll see each other next time I get up to DC and we have this pandemic behind us.
Absolutely. Thank you, Anson and Judy, and thank you, AFE, IENT providers, and Shannon and everyone else that has joined us. I really celebrate and applaud the work that you guys have been doing. And you guys have been reporting on this since 2017, so it isn't really new for you, but it is helping us to take this to the next level. So thank you all, and have a blessed remainder of your day. We'll be in touch. Bye-bye, everybody.
Bye-bye.
Thanks. This is very exciting.